In this episode, we're going to make cross-border data transfers feel understandable instead of mysterious, and we'll do it by focusing on the practical purpose of a Transfer Impact Assessment, TIA. When personal data moves from one country to another, the risk is not only about whether the data is protected by strong passwords and careful employees. The risk also comes from the legal environment the data enters, because different countries give different powers to governments, courts, and agencies, and those powers can affect whether people's data stays protected in the way you promised. A TIA is the structured way to ask whether a transfer is safe enough, what safeguards are needed, and what evidence you can keep to prove you made thoughtful decisions. Beginners sometimes assume that if a vendor is reputable, the transfer is automatically acceptable, but the transfer question is broader than vendor quality. It's about the combination of data type, transfer path, destination country environment, and the safeguards you can realistically apply. The goal is not to block all transfers, because modern services often depend on global infrastructure. The goal is to understand the risk, reduce it where you can, and document your reasoning in a way that supports accountability. By the end, you should be able to explain why TIAs exist, what they look at, and how they create evidence that stands up when someone asks hard questions later. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To get grounded, it helps to define what a cross-border transfer actually is in privacy program terms. A cross-border transfer happens when personal data is sent, accessed, stored, or made available in another country, even if the business operation feels local. For example, a company in one country might use a support service whose staff work in another country, which means personal data is accessed across borders. A company might store backups in a data center located elsewhere, which means data resides across borders. A company might use a global analytics service that processes data in multiple regions, which means the transfer path can be complex. Beginners often imagine a transfer as a single file sent overseas, but transfers are usually ongoing and embedded in normal operations. That is why risk management for transfers is not a one-time decision, and it is a continuing responsibility. The more you understand that transfers can happen through access, storage, and processing, the more accurately you can assess them. A TIA is meant to look at that real-life picture rather than a simplified story. Transfer risk is often misunderstood as purely technical, but it has a legal and human dimension that matters just as much. Different countries have different rules about when authorities can demand access to data, what oversight exists, and whether individuals can challenge that access. Even when a company is careful, a government request could force disclosure, or the legal system might not offer the same protections that individuals would have in the originating country. This is the heart of why transfer assessments exist, to evaluate whether the destination environment undermines the protections people expect. It is also why a TIA is not the same as a normal vendor assessment. A vendor assessment asks whether the vendor is competent, secure, and reliable. A TIA asks whether the legal context plus the transfer arrangement creates additional risk, and whether safeguards can meaningfully reduce that risk. You can have an excellent vendor in a challenging legal environment, and the transfer could still require extra safeguards. You can also have a weak vendor in a friendly environment, and the transfer could still be risky for different reasons. TIA thinking helps you separate these issues and manage them with the right tools. A helpful way to understand a TIA is to see it as answering 3 questions in order. What is being transferred? Where is it going, and who can reach it? And what could realistically happen to it given that environment? What is being transferred includes data categories, sensitivity, volume, and whether the data can identify individuals directly or indirectly. Where it is going includes destination countries, the physical or logical storage locations, and the access locations of people who might handle the data. Who can reach it includes the vendor's staff, any subprocessors, and any other parties with potential access, including through support or administration. What could happen includes not only unauthorized access by criminals, but also compelled access by authorities, accidental exposure through misconfiguration, and secondary use that goes beyond what was intended. This is why TIAs often require a clear description of the transfer arrangement, because you cannot evaluate risk without knowing the real path of the data. Beginners sometimes feel overwhelmed by this, but the goal is not to map every cable and every server. The goal is to understand the meaningful exposure points, which are the places where the data could be accessed or moved in ways that matter. To manage transfer risk well, you also need to understand the idea of transfer mechanisms and safeguards, because a TIA does not exist in isolation. A transfer mechanism is the legal and contractual basis that the organization uses to justify the transfer, while safeguards are the practical protections that reduce risk in reality. Even without getting into legal jargon, the basic point is that documentation alone does not protect data, and technical controls alone do not always address legal environment risk. Safeguards can include strong encryption, careful key management, strict access controls, limited administrative access, strong logging and monitoring, and clear contractual commitments about how the vendor responds to government requests. Safeguards can also include operational practices, like limiting who can support the service, requiring approval for subprocessor changes, and ensuring the vendor has a process for challenging overbroad requests where allowed. The TIA is where you decide which safeguards are needed given the specific transfer and destination. It is also where you consider whether the safeguards are realistic, because it does not help to list protections that no one will implement. In a good TIA, the safeguards are not generic, and they are tied to specific risks you identified. Because this topic is about evidence, it's important to understand what evidence a TIA is meant to produce. Evidence is not just a final conclusion like low risk or acceptable. Evidence is the chain of reasoning and the supporting facts that show you evaluated the transfer responsibly. That includes evidence of what data is involved, evidence of what countries and entities are part of the transfer, evidence of what safeguards exist, and evidence of how the vendor operates in practice. It can also include evidence that you evaluated whether the vendor uses subprocessors, whether data localization options exist, and whether the vendor has a history of transparency about government access requests. Evidence might involve written statements, documentation, audit reports, or other assurance materials, but the key is that the evidence supports your conclusions. A TIA that has no supporting facts is just an opinion, and opinions do not stand up well when regulators, customers, or internal auditors ask questions. When you think of a TIA as evidence building, you naturally focus on collecting information that is specific enough to be meaningful. That is the difference between a TIA as paperwork and a TIA as a defensible decision record. A practical TIA also involves assessing the likelihood and impact of transfer-related harm in a way that is consistent and not overly dramatic. Likelihood and transfer risk can be tricky because many harmful events are rare, but rarity does not automatically make risk low if the impact would be severe. For example, compelled disclosure might not happen often, but if it did, it could expose sensitive information or undermine promises made to individuals. Impact depends on the sensitivity of the data, the ability to identify individuals, the scale of the transfer, and the consequences of exposure. A large transfer of sensitive data about health or location generally carries higher impact than a small transfer of limited contact information, even if both are protected. Scoring does not need complex math, but it does need clarity about assumptions, like how strong encryption is, who controls the keys, and whether the vendor can access data in readable form. A key transfer risk concept is whether the data is accessible in plain text by the vendor or by parties in the destination environment. If it is not accessible, certain risks decrease, but other risks like metadata exposure may remain. The TIA helps you reason through these nuances rather than assuming all transfers are equally risky. One of the most important parts of transfer risk management is the concept of proportionality, meaning you do not apply the heaviest measures to every transfer. Proportionality is about matching effort and safeguards to the risk level. If the transfer involves high sensitivity, high volume, broad access, or destinations with challenging legal environments, you should demand stronger safeguards and more frequent review. If the transfer is limited and low sensitivity, you might use lighter safeguards while still documenting the decision and maintaining basic controls. Proportionality also includes considering alternatives, such as minimizing what data is transferred, using regional processing where possible, or redesigning the service so the most sensitive parts stay local. Beginners sometimes assume the only two options are allow the transfer or block it, but in reality, there are often middle options that reduce risk without stopping the business. Transfer risk management is about shaping the transfer, not just approving it. A good TIA includes these design considerations and shows that you tried to reduce risk at the source. Transfer risk is also connected to vendor management because third parties often create the cross-border pathways that organizations rely on. A TIA should pay attention to subprocessors because subprocessors can introduce new destinations and new access points over time. A vendor might change their infrastructure, expand support operations, or add new partners, and suddenly a transfer that was originally limited becomes broader. This is why TIA work is not only about the initial assessment, but also about ongoing monitoring and update triggers. You want to know when you should rerun or update the assessment, such as when the vendor changes where data is stored, when they add a new subprocessor, when the service scope expands, or when legal conditions in the destination change significantly. The goal is to prevent silent drift, where the transfer arrangement becomes riskier without anyone noticing. Ongoing evidence includes change notices, periodic confirmation of data location, and checks that safeguards are still in place. This is where TIA work connects directly to program monitoring, because evidence must stay current to remain credible. Another beginner trap is focusing only on the destination country and forgetting that the transfer path and access model can matter just as much. For example, data could be stored in one country but administered from another, or support could access it from many locations depending on where staff are located. Data might also move through multiple services, such as a hosting provider, a monitoring provider, and a support platform, each with its own cross-border footprint. A good TIA aims to understand the meaningful points where data is readable, where it can be extracted, and where it can be compelled. This is why understanding the access model is so important, because risk is higher when many people can access data in readable form and lower when access is strictly limited and tightly monitored. It is also why encryption details matter conceptually, even if you are not configuring anything, because encryption can change whether a vendor can read the data. If the vendor cannot read the data, certain legal environment risks may be reduced, though not necessarily eliminated. Thinking about transfer risk as a combination of destination, path, and access makes your analysis more accurate and helps you choose safeguards that actually address the risk. To make TIAs useful for decision-making, you also need to connect the assessment to a clear conclusion and next actions, rather than leaving it as a pile of observations. A strong conclusion explains whether the transfer can proceed as designed, whether it must proceed with added safeguards, whether it should be limited in scope, or whether the risk is too high without major redesign. It also includes a clear summary of key risks, the safeguards that address them, and what evidence supports the conclusion. If the conclusion depends on mitigations that are not yet implemented, the assessment should record that and treat the risk as unresolved until the mitigations are in place. This is important because evidence must reflect reality, not plans. The assessment should also state ownership and review expectations, meaning who is responsible for maintaining safeguards and when the assessment should be revisited. This helps prevent the common problem where a transfer is approved once and never checked again, even as the world changes. The core lesson is that ATIA is not finished when it is written, but when decisions are implemented and evidence supports those decisions. As we close, the fundamental value of a transfer impact assessment is that it turns a complicated, cross-border risk question into a structured, defensible decision process. It helps you clearly describe what data is moving, where it is going, who can reach it, and what risks exist in that environment. It helps you select safeguards that actually match those risks, rather than relying on generic assurances. It also helps you build and maintain evidence that you can show later, proving you did not ignore foreseeable issues. In a modern privacy program, cross-border transfers are common, and the organizations that handle them well are the ones that treat transfer risk as a living responsibility, not a one-time hurdle. For brand new learners, the most important takeaway is that transfer risk is not just about technology and not just about contracts. but about the intersection of data, access, and legal environment. A well-run TIA makes that intersection visible, manageable, and explainable, which is exactly what Privacy Program Accountability is supposed to achieve.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.